Well, thanks for joining us online. I wonder when the most recent time in your life was that you were satisfied. Whether it was after a good meal, having completed a project at home or at work, or whether it was just a day sort of panning out just as you had thought, and that there was a deep sense of satisfaction. There's something in this world that often means that satisfaction is elusive. There are many obstacles. There are many situations that don't pan out as we want. There's plenty of opportunities for us to express our disappointment. Sometimes we are dissatisfied because we don't really have the means to achieve what it is that we desire. You know, university students living off tuna and rice, it might be okay for a week or two, but as the months roll by, there's a sense that this meal, although probably nourishing, doesn't really satisfy. There's other situations in our life where we sort of overextend, we dream too big, we push too hard. And whether it's the home renovation that sort of got a little bit too big and so never really got finished, or whether it's us burning the candles at both ends of the day, often we become dissatisfied because we've overextended ourselves. But for others of us, the sense of being satisfied is something that we just don't even allow ourselves to be. We're so perfectionist in all that we do that we can never look at something that we've been involved in and truly have a sense of contentment and appreciation and fulfillment. There's always that little bit that you think, I could have done that differently. There's that little error. It doesn't quite look right. It's not exactly how I wanted. Now, it's not that being dissatisfied is bad, because often it motivates us to do good things. When we're dissatisfied with the layout of our house, often we'll go for a spring clean, we'll reorganize things, it will function better. Sometimes when we're dissatisfied with the condition of our body, then we're motivated to think more intently about what we eat, be more disciplined with our exercise. And often situations at work when we're dissatisfied with the position that we're in or the state of affairs, that it's the catalyst for change that often brings about great results. There's something deep in the human psyche that desires satisfaction. We sort of hunger for it, don't we? So maybe it's about getting that place that we can call our own, or paying off the final bit of the mortgage so that we do actually own it. Perhaps in these COVID times, it's about being able to travel where we want to go, or being able to do the kind of recreations that we enjoy. And now, as we come to Jesus' most famous Sermon on the Mount, we see that he is not too distant or not too removed from this human desire to be satisfied. Here in our next beatitude, we see that Jesus engages with this common human desire. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Jesus here is offering satisfaction. He's giving hope of being fulfilled. But he says that satisfaction, whilst being the end, is not the means to that end. It's not that we should be chasing after being satisfied. It's not that we should fully invest in feeling fulfilled. But rather, Jesus suggests that it's the byproduct. That if we pursue something else, then true satisfaction will result. And that something else is this idea of righteousness that we're going to look at now. And now this isn't a brand new idea from Jesus. God's people, having been shaped by the scriptures in the Old Testament, always had this perspective that ultimately their affections, their hunger, should be for God. And that with that alignment, their perception and satisfaction with reality would be adequate. And so in Psalm 42, we see this image that would have evoked the mindset of the Jewish people. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for my God. It's aspirational. It's not everyone's experience, but it's upheld here as the right sort of orientation. To desire what God is offering is actually the means of achieving the end of ultimate satisfaction. Now, if we just sort of recap the context which Jesus is for this Sermon on the Mount. We remember that he's been displaying public signs of power, healing. He's been teaching in ways that is direct and controversial. He's been calling people to turn from the way that they're living towards the direction that he is pointing. He's been calling individuals by name and asking them to follow him. And as he's begun this sermon, he's been outlining these beatitudes, these countercultural descriptions of what God said is the blessed life. And as we've seen the last few weeks, this idea of being blessed is a holistic picture of what it means to flourish as a human. It's really all that the law, wisdom, and the prophets had spoke about in the Old Testament. It is encapsulated as God's desire for all people. It's the kind of life that Jesus himself would embody, and it's actually the kind of life that citizens of the kingdom that Jesus is about to establish will actually realize in their experience. So blessed are those who hunger and thirst. So let's just stop and think about what it means to hunger and thirst. Well, it's really about what we desire, isn't it? Think back to the last time that you were truly hungry, that you were deeply thirsty. Last week on Australia Day, I'd been doing some exercise. It was hot day. And when I finally got back in and I could just drink, I felt like I just couldn't stop. There was just dehydration within me. I just desperately sought and desired the water that would replenish me. And when we're hungry and truly thirsty, it is our number one priority. We long for the substance that will fill us. We are eager to get anything within us that will help us feel normal again. And so to hunger and thirst is the opposite of when we refuse food. When we sort of say, no, I'm good. I don't really want to accept what you're offering. Or I don't really like what you're offering, so I'll just get my own. Or look, I already ate before I got here, so I'm really not that hungry. But it's not just with food and drink that we hunger in life. There's plenty of other things in our life that we are ambitious for, that we hunger after, that become all-consuming. The things that we give all of our focus, our energy, and our effort towards. Work, relationship, interests, hobbies, projects, that we just fill ourselves up. And so this idea of hungering and thirsting is about something that is deep, something that drives our affections, it shapes our behavior, and that we pursue it for the end of being satisfied. To actually hunger and thirst, it's a painful experience. And there's a sense of being desperate. There's a sense of realizing that without this input into our life, we won't function as we desire. And so Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's about those who have a passionate concern for what's right. Now, this isn't just sort of the occasional interest in what's right. It's not like the sort of, do you like oysters? Oh yeah, I've had them once or twice. I'll eat them on a special occasion. A hunger and concern is a daily and regular experience of deeply thirsting for what God says is good. And now righteousness is a major theme in Matthew's gospel that we're looking at this year. In fact, it's a major theme throughout the whole of the Bible. In its essence, it's about being right with God. And when you're right with God, it means that you're with God, that you're able to be in relationship with him. And so if we just think about it in 3 quick steps, step 1 of righteousness that we find in the Bible is that things aren't right between humans and God. Unrighteousness is demonstrated by people, and it grieves God. We are all guilty of unrighteousness, and that unrighteousness, our rejection of what's right, separates us from God. And so step 2 in the righteousness story of the Bible is that God is wanting to make things right. both on an individual and a communal level. God is wanting individuals to be restored to him. He's wanting a people to call his own, a people who love him, a people who live according to his design and desires for them, a people who will worship him. And so step 3 is that God's people, having been made right through Jesus, would love and desire what is right. They would love and cherish being in a right relationship with God. They would want to interact with that relationship by continuing to understand and pursue what God says is right. Now, this relationship is secured not on our ability to pursue and hunger for righteousness. As we saw the other week in this great description, righteousness is given to people because of the substitution of Jesus. That Jesus, who was perfectly embodied righteousness, he lived the right way according to the Father in all situations. He who knew no sin became sin so that those who trust in him would become the righteousness of God. People are made right by trusting in Jesus. The righteousness that Jesus is talking about here is a gift. It's not something that we achieve ourselves. And so this righteousness cannot be produced from within. It's a righteousness that is declared on an individual who trusts in Jesus. And because of that, it's a righteousness that is secured. Jesus secures the righteousness of those who trust in him. But righteousness is also something that is increasingly embodied in the life of those who trust Jesus. And so as we see, this looks like a desire, an increasing desire to be free from sin, to put off the desires that are against God's intent, and to increasingly know, love, and obey what God has said is right. Now, Jesus has said in John's Gospel that he is the living water, that those who are thirsty will find nourishment through him. And so unrighteousness is really sort of like drinking seawater. You know, we were at the beach the other week and it was really hot. And it's sort of that weird thing when you're in the water, out at sea, and all this water is around you and you're deeply thirsty, but the seawater is not going to satisfy you. In fact, it's going to do the complete opposite. Seawater is going to make anyone who consumes it deeply sick. It is about not drinking things like the seawater, those things that are not in line with God's values and his direction. It's about starting to not just accept lies as part of life, but growing to hate them, to see the goodness in truth. And so what this might look like is that in speaking, we just want to say what is true. That in investigations or in our workplace, we want to make sure that truth is uncovered, that truth is advocated, and that we wouldn't just accept white lies, that we wouldn't just accept distortions of the truth, but to hunger and thirst for righteousness is to increasingly know and love what God says is good. Now, the reality is this isn't going to be an easier way to live. That's why it's difficult to continue to remain hungry for righteousness. Sometimes it's just easier to go with the flow. But to hunger and thirst for righteousness is the better path. And like when physically we start to eat good food, our body starts to desire it. When we're eating healthily, our body expects that. It realizes that this good food produces a good amount of energy so that we can do the things in life that we want. And so the more that we crave righteousness over unrighteousness, the more we learn to love it. And the more we'll want it in every situation of our life. You see, this isn't about just doing the right thing. This is about being transformed from the inside out, that our desires and our values become more and more aligned with God's. It's about growing in longing for holiness. Now, one of the great dangers in maintaining this hunger and thirst for righteousness is pursuing respectability over righteousness. So to be so worried about the reputation that we have of those around us that we sort of disregard what God says is right, and we just sort of play the room. We mimic people's behaviour, we toe the party line, we say what people want to hear rather than perhaps what God says is right and true. Another danger to hungering for righteousness is finding refuge and comfort or escapism in unrighteousness. Now, perhaps this often works out that we've got scars from the past, we've been deeply hurt, and perhaps we just don't think that God was there for us. And so our hunger for righteousness will be quite minimal if we are constantly indulging in unrighteousness. And now, substance is the quickest and easiest form of sort of consuming unrighteousness. But there's more subtle things. Think about how easy it is for bitterness, resentment, and animosity to sort of fuel us, to get us through the day. That we sort of walk around with this chip on our shoulder. But the thing with feeding on unrighteousness is that rather than giving life, it takes it, and will never be truly satisfied. Jesus, on the other hand, offers lasting fulfillment. This idea of being filled is literally like an animal that's been well fed, fattened up. God will not disappoint anyone who has a deep desire for his will. To long for righteousness ultimately will be an experience of being fulfilled, which is why it's an ongoing process. You see, the more that we hunger and thirst for righteousness, the more aware we will become of unrighteousness in our lives. We'll see later in the sermon and throughout Matthew's gospel that the religious leaders, the Pharisees, weren't hungry for more righteousness. They'd sort of reached this level where they were content with their own self-righteousness. And so they no longer saw any unrighteousness in their lives. They just saw people who fell below their standard. And for anyone who is filled with your own righteousness, you'll never hunger for God. And so again, we see that this is a gift. To be filled is a passive experience. That's because those who trust in Jesus are both declared perfect now because of his work, but are also being made perfect. And so the kind of fulfillment that Jesus promises is one that will be eventually realized, but at the moment is an ongoing growth. We will demonstrate our thirst for righteousness as we realize our need for Jesus, as we become aware of unrighteous motives, as we hear from others perhaps of unrighteous acts that we've been involved in. We aren't disillusioned by our unrighteousness, but we are exposed to our need to thirst more on the righteousness that has been secured by Jesus, which means that forgiveness is secure, but also to seek to have him transform our life into greater righteousness. You see, those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness will long for that day when all of our desires will be truly satisfied. Now, one of the great dangers that we face for that outlook is being content in the here and now. For here on earth, our righteousness and pursuing what God says is good and true, well, it's not really that well regarded, is it? It's generally not well rewarded. But pursuing righteousness is real and essential for anyone who's following Jesus. Another danger in continuing to hunger and thirst for righteousness is being overwhelmed by the disappointments that we face, the obstacles that come before us. And often these disappointments is because that we've set our expectations outside of what God's plan is. Now, it's easy to blame God, but we've got to ask ourselves, are we blaming him for something that he promised to deliver? Or are we blaming him for not delivering what we desired? It's easy for us to stop looking at our own failings and unrighteousness, to set a level and to then just worry about anyone else. The great danger from that is seen with the Pharisees, is that ultimately they lose their hunger for God. They trust in self and ultimately give up following Jesus, but rather following themselves. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." So friends, how hungry are you for righteousness? And when was the last time that you genuinely said, what has God's word got to say about this situation that I'm in? Or what does God want me to do in this situation that I'm facing? When was the last time that you prayed and asked God to show you how to respond rightly rather than simply asking him to deliver your plan? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled.